Looks like we have people starting to log on. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I know it'll take people a minute or two to find their way here in some cases. So I'm going to do some preliminary introductions while that's happening. It's just great that you all tuned in. I know we're all Zoom exhausted these days, so many obligations, not to mention a good deal of stress about the state of the world and democracy and other issues. So we're very grateful that you choosing to spend some of your precious time and energy with us. I'll introduce our speaker briefly in a moment, but Kaleikoa Ka'eo is absolutely engaging. We're in for a treat. We're going to learn a lot. So this is a good thing for us, for the Capps Center to be doing. He'll be speaking with us about indigenous origin narratives and place-based ethics. This, needless to say, this is an urgent issue in an urgent time. I think we all feel like our democracy is imperiled in all kinds of different ways. And so that raises questions about where did things go wrong and how might we think forward as humans in a better way. And certainly coming to terms with how Indigenous peoples have been treated and the status of their ongoing lives and their place, their traditions, their robust traditions. We need to know more and learn more about these things. So by way of some introductions, I'm Greg Johnson. I'm the director of the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life here at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I'm also professor of religious studies. The Capps Center has a long history of engaging the difficult issues of our times. And this symposium series continues that tradition. It's a year-long symposium series on Indigenous place-based ethics. We have other events coming yet this quarter. We have an event in mid-November, November 12th, with Carla Fredericks from University of Colorado Law School. She'll speak to us about questions of names and mascots, and in particular, the Washington Redskins mascot issue. So basic cultural representations of Indigenous peoples and what's at stake therein. A few weeks later, on December 1st, please tune in. Kyle White will be in conversation with our own David Pello about Indigenous land ethics in conversation with intersectional ethics. Again, December 1st. Stay tuned for our winter and spring programming. We're putting that together now. It's an exciting time to be thinking about these issues. Some thank yous. Our co-sponsors, the American Indian and Indigenous Collective here at UC Santa Barbara, has partnered with us. We're grateful. Thank yous to our longstanding donors who make all of our projects possible. To our staff, Maeve DeVoy, the Associate Director, and Alma Mendoza, our student helper, who've done so much to make these things possible. A couple other Capps Center events to bring to your attention. Two events, student-based, about the upcoming election. What are students' hopes and concerns with regard to the election? And this is October 26th and also November 10th. Please tune in. It's a panel of students and a moderator. We need to be hearing from students about their concerns, and this is the way to do it. I'm excited for it. Another thing we have going on at the Capps Center that I want to bring to your attention, we are excited to be the new institutional host for a podcast. And this is a podcast that's as timely as could be. It's Straight White American Jesus. This is a podcast devoted to thinking hard about white nationalism and Christianity. Where is this coming from? What are the undercurrents that fuel it, and so forth, and also broader questions about evangelical Christianity today. This is headed up by Brad Onishi, and he's a former UCSB PhD student, now a professor at Swarthmore College. You can find the link to their podcast on our webpage, and I just couldn't be more excited and honored that we can host their work. Okay. I want to make a land acknowledgement here. We are in Santa Barbara. We are on the land of the Chumash peoples, on the unceded lands of the Chumash people. This is important for a conversation like ours to acknowledge at the outset. Our guest, Professor Kaleikoa Ka'eo. He is educator of the highest order in many respects. Not only is he a professor at University of Hawaii, Maui College, he is a ground level educator. He's in the fields, he's on the front lines of protests, he's working with young children, whether it's with revitalizing Hawaiian language, food sovereignty, sacred site protection, burial protections, as are happening this very day on Maui, as he can attest. He's a leader in so many respects. I came to know him some years ago. I was in conversation with my dear friend, Halealoha Ayao, who's an expert in repatriation issues, and I kept pestering him, hey, tell me more about Hawaiian origin stories. Tell me more about the cosmogonic myths and stories. And he says, you need to meet Kaleikoa. He's the source. And so finally we did get together, and it's always a pleasure. I always learn so much from this most gifted intellectual and human being. And I'm just so honored, Kaleikoa, that you're joining us, Professor Ka'eo, for this first event in our year-long symposium on Indigenous place-based ethics. There's much more to be said by way of introduction, but I'll stop because we want to hear from you. Kaleikoa Ka'eo is going to speak with us for about 40 minutes or so. I'll jump in towards the end. We'll have a bit of a conversation about some of these issues, but then we'll open it up to audience questions. So please do send them in the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to get to them. And I want to greet folks from Hawaii, Kapai Aina. Thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure. And I want to greet the rest of our guests as well. So without further ado, Professor Ka'eo, thank you.
Mahalo, mahalo. Kabeli ana ya'u kua pau, mahalo nui ya oi. Greg, ko kono ana ya'u. No leila, uli mua kako. Alu au malama wele ka naka ailuna. Wa kaio ku hakula, kaho akali. Nau hi oi kau puava uli puava ke a moa kane moa hini mai kina kau lele kalani. O au ke liu e ke aka. O ke aka no ia mai tahiti tuhua tahiti moi mai tahiti tapu ha kane. Eia mai ka pule ka waiha ke akua. Naina ia oe ke akua. E ulano e toho puatani e ta mauliola. E ola hoi o mauliola. E ola ia oe tani tumelono. Oia ho oia e ola. Kaweli ana ia uko. And I like to first mahalo my brother Greg, and I call him my brother with much respect. Especially for my Kanaka, our Lahui Kanaka out there, they may be watching, listening. You know, Brother Greg has actually worked with our people on many occasions, especially in regards to the protection of our burials, our iwi kupuna, along with the repatriation of our burial or funerary objects that have been taken by various museums and have been returned home. So, you know, Greg knows our people very well. He comes to Maui quite often, except for COVID this year. So hopefully I see him again real soon. And so I really mahalo, thank you, and, you know, give me this honor of sharing and speaking, especially in the pole position, as they would say. And I didn't realize that until recently. So without further ado, I'm gonna just get rolling. And first of all, I want to apologize that, you know, this is a topic that I've never really spoke without a live audience before. And so it's something kind of new for me. But you know, these ideas of ethics, yeah, and of course, what are ethics? Yeah, things like morals, moral principles, the ideas of what is good, what is bad, you know, how do we behave? You know, land-based, you know, ethics, or place-based ethics, and you know, ideas of course, of creation and the cosmogonies. And for me, you know, I really believe at the core of humanity, of all peoples, and I repeat, all peoples, is our cosmogonies. Now the word cosmogony is a good college word, as I tell my students, yeah, kind of breaks up with cosmos. As we know, the cosmos, the universe, everything around us, and gonos, Gonos is the word for like generation, like a genealogy. So a cosmogony is like a genealogy of everything, the genealogy of the cosmos. Now that's not the same as a cosmology, which generally refers to a scientific explanation. So a cosmogony is a story, it's a mythology, and it may incorporate scientific principles, which are cosmogony, and I would say our cosmogonies have. And I use the word cosmogonies for Hawaii in that if you understand a little bit about our people and the history of our people, we do not have one cosmogony, in fact, but we have multiple stories of so-called creation or stories of the birth of everything. And it's from those stories I'm kind of going to talk about to kind of tell our story, our traditional stories, and really perhaps how that can help to push up or to talk to or to have this discussion on what so-called principle democracy perhaps could be. And the first thing we kind of got to recognize is that, you know, I would argue that all humanity, all human beings have these stories. And they're very fundamental to what humanity is. And I would quickly suggest for our people, the Lahui Kanaka, it is really impossible to be thinking in a Lahui Kanaka way without a real understanding of your so-called cosmogony. Because the cosmogony gives you a birth, yeah, which gives you a history, which of course provides you with the guidance of where the future should be. And I use the word should be because in the Hawaiian perspective, when we think about cosmogonies, when we think about creation, creation is not an event that occurred. Yeah, creation is an event that is ongoing. So what we do today is part of so-called creation. What we do today, of course, will create the future. And let me go right into our, traditional cosmogony. And we have several, but I'm gonna kind of talk a little bit about what we call Hemele Kumulipo. So Hemele Kumulipo is kind of what we consider like a grandmother of all cosmogonies. That it really encompasses a huge story. And first of all, as a cosmogony, Hemele Kumulipo is a mele in that it's a song, it's poetry, it's history, it's genealogy, it's a narrative, it's mythology, and it's all kind of enwrapped. And oh, sorry, somebody's trying to call me. I don't know what's going on. It's all wrapped up into this one great mele, as we call it in Hawaiian. Now, Hemele Kumulipo is roughly about over 2,000 lines long, about 2,100 lines long. I was part of a group, thanks to my kumu, Kamuela, who about 20 years ago performed the Kumulipo. And it took us roughly about 3 hours to perform. So it's a very long mele, but it's a mele that really sits, not so much as a story of the past, you see, but it's a story that provides us guidance and nutrients in many ways for our brains and our soul to push us and perhaps where we need to go into the future. Now, we all have cosmogonies. We all have cosmogonies. So let's kind of start at our own. And so in the opening lines of our Mele Kumulipo, O ke awi ka huli vela taho nua, o ke awi ka huli lo le kalani. And in the opening lines of our Kumulipo, o ke au, the word au in Hawaiian spelled A-U in English, au. In Hawaii, we have this clear understanding that words and lyrics are never really meant to be understood in a literal sense, and that they're always loaded with multiple meanings. In Hawaiian, that we use the word kauna to explain this idea that, when you hear a particular word like au, in a Hawaiian way of thinking, we always have to understand it doesn't have an exact meaning, but it has a multiplicity of meaning. So from the very beginning in our ideas as a people, we realize that to suggest somehow that words, and again, this is something to kind of compare to like a Judeo-Christian kind of idea, especially a fundamentalist idea that you have this kind of literal translation. And in fact, we can look at the opening lines again. O ke au, the word au is one of those words, 2 letters, Ao means the world in a sense. Everything, ao. Space is ao. Ao is also the word for time, like epoch of time, great time. Ao is also I, myself, I, ao. Ao also has another meaning, which is to, like a current, the way a current moves in the ocean, ao. So for the opening lines, the very first line of our cosmogony, time and space, or space-time, is the first concept that is planted in the first line of this particular cosmogony. Now, where have you heard the concept of space-time before? What great minds have talked about space and time really being the same? Of course, the great mind, Einstein. Now, I'm not suggesting that Einstein copied our cosmogony, but I'm here to suggest that our kupuna, our elders, our kupuna, understood fundamentally these kinds of ideas. O Ka'eo I Kahuli, that time and space, like a current. I kahuli, and the word kahuli means to change or to evolve or start to move. Kahuli, to turn what is inside outside, what is up becomes down. So time, space, and flow begins. O Ka'eo I Kahuli lole kalani, and time and space and the currents are moving also. Lole kalani, and what it refers to, kalani being the heavens above, and the heavens will reverse. Now again, this is poetry. This is not a scientific explanation, but you can already see our kupuna, our kanaka, lahui kanaka, have a keen understanding of science. And this is why I suggest that we must be clear that when we hear about arguments that go on today, for example, where astronomers will say that when you look at the struggle over what's going on in Mauna Kea, that somehow that we as a people, our culture somehow is anti-science, it really showcases that they really know nothing about what our culture is. And in fact, as I have always said, from the very beginning of our culture, science or scientific principles is foundational. So how can we as a people be anti-science? You see, because our culture is based upon science. Now, what I always say is that we don't have issues with science, but definitely we have issues with scientists, especially settler colonial scientists who want to impose upon us their so-called worldview. So, o ke awi kahuli vela kaho nua, o ke awi kahuli vela kaho nua. Time and space is right. And then the word vela kaho nua, and as I tell my students, I want everybody at home, take your hands, clap your hands together, rub your hands real hard. Yeah, what happens? What happens? Vela kaho nua. And of course, we should realize it heats up. There's friction. And so early on, and again, this is just the first line of the Kumulipo. Time and space turn, but what's the foundation? What's the foundation of everything that comes later? In Hawaiian, we use the word vela, which of course is heat, or what we could say is energy. That everything that comes later is all formed from the foundations of energy. And I would suggest that so-called even modern physical scientists today would agree that everything around us, everything, this hat, my body, this table, is all made up, in fact, of energy. And so my point is just to make it clear, if you have any doubt about our people being scientific and minded, I would suggest all you need to do is to look at our cosmogony, and you would clearly see from the opening lines of our Kumulipo, it is based upon scientific principles. Now let's do a comparison, right? Let's look at cosmogonies. What's another famous cosmogony, perhaps that I'm going to assume that most people out there recognize, right? And that's the cosmogony with Genesis. So we can look at something like Genesis. Now in Genesis, and I think it's in the first section, 26, I think, paragraph, if I remember right, it talks about 28. Yeah, 28. It talks about, in a sense, what is it? Be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. and subdue it and have what? Dominion, basically, over everything. And I think this is a very important point. That language of dominion, what does the word dominion mean? And of course, the root word of dominion is something that you have control over, like a lord, to own, to so-called dominate, right? If this is my dominion, this is my property. Everything is for my use, in fact, my ownership. So from the foundations, even of the Judeo-Christian ideas, and more importantly, how it applies to today, in today's world, yeah, in this kind of settler colonial world, in what we would say in Hawaii, the haole world, or the Euro-American Western world. This idea that everything around us, the so-called environment, all the biota, all the life forms are something that we should dominate, that we in fact are like the lords and kings over everything around us. That is a particular narrative, that's a particular story, a mythology, a cosmogony that lives to this day. And I would argue that, in fact, is the reason why we are in trouble today. The reason, in fact, we have a crisis like global warming or climate change or pollutions in the ocean or the destruction of forest lands and the pollution of the waterways is due to that mentality, in fact, that everything around us is to serve our needs. Now, in the Hawaiian cosmogony, it's very different. I'm going to get kind of right into it right now. That everything around us, in fact, is familial, and that's the word we use, right? It's genealogically connected. So when we look at the kumulipo, right, it begins with the cosmos, the creation of the stars themselves. And we think in Hawaiian sense, genealogically, when Hawaiians said that the stars are our ancestors, this is not some kind of like, cultural mythology that's, that doesn't have a scientific basis. In fact, all of us should realize we are the stars, that we are the descendants of the stars. Everything that makes up our physical being, everything on this planet, everything in my office are all made up of stardust. In fact, that we are physically the stars. So our ancestors even understood that the world around us is related to us. And in the Hawaiian cosmogony of the kumulipo, in fact, we are the youngest in many ways of this great genealogy, that everything in fact is ancestral. Now that's a very different world. Think in comparison. Yeah. What is a tree to our people? What is the mountain to our people? As my good friend, taught me, that we can look at the world and we can talk about a banana, right? How is a banana related to the human being? Well, as my biotech friend explained to me, about 70% plus of the DNA, the sequence of the DNA in a banana is related to the human being. In other words, we are genetically connected to even a banana. The point I'm trying to make is that we as Native peoples, especially as Kanaka, understood this scientific principle, that the world around us is us. And not just us, but the world around us are ancestral. And in fact, therefore, as ancestors, should be regarded as ancestors and be held in high esteem. Now, that's a very different world, right? If we looked at the idea of having dominion of everything out there, everything out there is for our use. So what you see going on in the world today are really two separate philosophies of survival, two separate philosophies of how we exist upon this planet, or what we call Earth. Yeah. And for natives and for Kanaka, we see ourselves again as the youngest child in this great story of creation. Now, in the coming of the kumulipo, then it starts to talk about the first life forms that appear here. And the first life forms appear where? Hanau ukukoko, hanau kanaka ako ko puka, hanau te toi onuhi eleo po hono, hanau kare to epuka, hanau kapeo kapea pea kanake puka, hanau kaina kaina, hanau kahali. The first life forms appear that are born come out of the ocean. And the first significant life form that's named is what we said ukukoakoa, or you might think of the coral polyp, the live coral polyp from the ocean is seen as being the most simplest life form. And I use the word simplest because it's important to remember that our kupuna, before I forget, is that we understood principles of evolution and natural selection way before there ever was a guy named Darwin who walked upon this planet. And this is actually unlike many other so-called native peoples in their own cosmogonies. But the ukukoka, life starts where? Out of the ocean. Now, is that scientifically correct? Of course it is. You want to compare that to Genesis? You want to compare that to Noah's Ark? You want to compare that to other mythologies and cosmologies? My point is, our cosmogony, our worldview is based upon scientific principles that was already understood way before any European understood ideas of evolution. So evolution and the principles of evolution was not something that was brought here to teach us. It was something we already knew wholeheartedly, that was encompassed in our ancient songs of long ago. But how we look at this world, we can look at words like we have in Hawaiian, like aina. And I'll get into the idea of what's called aloha aina oi'i, but aina, yeah, what simply, the Haole world will call land. But aina is way more than, in fact, land. Yeah, aina can be referred to that which feeds us, that which gives us life, shelter, food. Yeah. Aina comes from the Polynesian, the Proto-Polynesian word kainga. Now, the word kainga in Proto-Polynesian, your older Polynesian language, is an interesting word. Kainga actually means family. So you can see in the etymology of that word, coming from the word family to later to become for the word that we use for what simply is called land or aina. The land itself is familial. We are physically the child of the land. Scientifically, we are created by the so-called land. So when you think about how we look at things, when we use the word aina, yeah, this comes from a particular cosmogony, a particular story, mythology, a trajectory of history. Well, let's look at the so-called Haole world, how they look at land. You hear words like property. Now, what does property mean? Dominion? Real estate? What is real estate? My point is, you can clearly see even in the English language, they do not have a word for aina. In the same way, we did not have a word for private property. It was a word we actually had to make up later on when capitalism was brought to our islands. But the point I want you to understand is that even through our language, that's why language is key. In our language, it tells us aina does not equal real estate. Aina does not equal private property. Aina is something that we get life from, that sustains us. And I would actually suggest perhaps that in all peoples, this is something of an ancient history that all peoples have. Now, the Kumulipo, after the coming of the ocean life forms, and I'm going to move real quickly, yeah, during the first chapter, they start to pair off life forms that are named what we call in the ocean and the sea. And an important line, a refrain that appears over and over, O kani wailoli, O kawahini wailola. Male for the narrow stream, female for the broad stream. And this is something that appears every time a new life form comes forward. This refrain is pronounced. But to make it simple, as I was taught, it is, of course, these are ideas in a poetic way, which are suggesting this sense of sexual evolution, right? You have what we consider a male force and a female force. And when you get the male and female together, you have new life. And so lives of new beings and biota come forward from this sexual reproduction. And then you have other important refrains that come up over and over. Yeah. Yeah. You have life forms born in the mountain and life forms born in the sea. But there's this idea in Hawaii that there is a connectivity of life between all beings, whether on land or in the sea. And then there's this peculiar important refrain. O ke akua ke komo, a oe komo kanaka. Akua, o ke akua enters. Now the word akua is the word for what you might call God or goddess or the divine one. Ke akua. Akua enters, not the human. Again, poetry. What's going on here? Well, as I was taught, there's a couple of meanings. One is that during this time period, it's a time period of the so-called gods and the divine ones. Humans have yet to come upon this earth. And the second, I think, which is interesting, is that when it says komo, the word komo means to enter. And the idea is that every life form, for example, the ekaha, yeah, particular kind of fern, as it appears, that every life form has akua within it. In other words, every life form is divine. Every life form is not just a child of God, but has the essence of divinity or godliness within it. Think about how we see the world at that point, or how we should see the world at that point, that we would see that it's not just human beings are the children of God or the gods, but in fact, all life forms are products of the divine. That's a very different world from one that is seen to be tools to be dominated. Yeah. Now, in the end of the Wa'akahi, and I'm trying to jump through, the very end, the lines, O ke kane hua vai akua kena o kalinaka vai ho'oli. Anyway, O ke kane hua vai, O ke kane, male. Hua vai is the word for, well, this is the new hua vai today, yeah. But huawai was our water containers. If you know what a water gourd looks like. Well, water gourd kind of is shaped in this way. Yeah, a very phallic symbol. O ke kane huawai. That the water gourd was compared to akua, that is God. Now you might be thinking, why are they saying a water gourd is God? Well, obviously we would first realize what's in the water gourd, but water itself, water is the foundation of all life. And you think about our people as they move, right? Of course, we all come out of Africa, and as we move out of Asia and we move into the Pacific, especially as we start to move through the islands, which eventually gets out here, what was the most important sacred space? But those that held drinking water and fresh water. So water symbolized life. See, when we talk about the word, even the word sacred is interesting. When people talk about, is Mauna Kea sacred or not sacred? In Hawaiian thinking, the word sacred is very simple to understand. It's not something that's kind of like you got to imagine about. Really, what is sacred? What are places that are coupled? Or places where life depends upon. The more important they are for providing us life, the more sacred they are. So when you look at Mauna Kea, at the tip top of the highest watershed in these islands, I repeat, the highest watershed in these islands, it's very simple to understand, like all watersheds, as human beings, we should have reverence for, should be seen as being sacred, places that you should be very, very careful in how you interact or how you might, in fact, desecrate, because all of our lives are dependent upon the protection of those places. So that idea of water is one that's very important. That's the element of life, because what is life but water? Yeah. And you think about the lesson about water as being seen as being godly or the power of life. Yeah. O kani wailoli, o kabahini wailola. As one of my teachers, Kumu Kavena, thought, right? If I had a seed right now, I just had a seed, right? And I put that seed, I put that seed on the ground, or I put the seed right on my table. What happens to that seed? Nothing, right? But we know there is latent life in that seed. But if I take some water and that power and divinity of water, and I pour that water upon that seed, what happens to that seed when it interacts with water? But life begins. And so in the poetic explanation of what is God, what is divinity, it is the power of life. That seed, that latent life in that seed becomes life because of that water. So this is why in Hawaii, in traditional times, all our so-called watersheds were seen as the most important sites to be protected because all of our lives depended upon these so-called watersheds. Yeah. Now at the end, I'm moving very quickly, but at the end of the first chapter, the last words that are pronounced are the word pono. The word po means darkness, yeah, lacking light. But po also means the time of sacredness, the time of the gods. That's po. In fact, we think about when we pass on, we will go to po to reside with our ancestors who reside in po. There are ancient kumuaku, our ancient foundational gods, all reside in po. But the word pono, in fact, the word, as we would say in Hawaii, pono means everything is what? In balance. Everything is right. Everything is righteous. It's perfect. It's good. Pono. In other words, at the end of the first chapter, everything is good. And so all the kind of life forms that come up are all the simple invertebrates of the ocean pop up in the first wa. And then in the second wa, in the second chapter, we have the swimming fishes and animals that swim up here. And again, oh no, everything is good. In the third wa, we have the flyers that appear. And again, oh no. In the fourth wa, we have the creepers, the crawlers, the egg layers that appear. In fact, the hono, the turtle, is a good example of that. I wish I had more time to kind of share what I usually would share, but I'm trying to move very quickly. And you have again, oh no. And then there's a shift. In the fifth wa, we have these, our first mammals. We have these pig-like creatures that appear. But what's interesting about the pig-like creatures, it's not just the physical creatures that they start to talk about. Now begins talking about the pig-like creatures, or the pigs having, having personalities and having psychologies. In other words, what you quickly see is that these ideas of evolution, that creatures and biota life form are getting more and more complex. And in the sixth wa, you have the rat. And in the seventh wa, you have the dog-like animals. Again, you can see this idea of progression, evolution. And in the eighth wa, we have the first human being. And her name is La'ila'i. Yeah, La'ila'i. And she comes from a place called Lalawaya, an ancient homeland of Lalawaya. And it said that she is the first human. But in the Hawaiian story, when she is born, now mind you, remember I talked about the pono. So at the end of the first seven wa, it's all pono, it's all balanced, it's all good. La'ila'i appears. And when she appears, we say, wow, which means his light. Now the light is on. It's no longer po, no longer pono. But ao is also like to say, to have consciousness, to be aware, to be awake, like the light is on. And so what la'ila'i represents is not in the Haole world sense of that kind of missing link that they're always looking for. In the Hawaiian, what's important is consciousness. The la'ila'i as the first female represents what makes us special as human beings, that we become consciousness, we become aware. And la'ila'i, because of this consciousness, what also happens when humans appear upon this earth? Pono, what happens to pono? It's not spoken again. To me, that's a very important lesson that a kupuna left for us, to remind us that we as human beings are descendants of all the life forms before us, all the way to the stars. But when we came upon this earth, this sense of consciousness is something that gave us this great mind to do the great things that we do, that makes us special, right? We know there are no other creatures in the world that can fly an airplane. There are no other creatures in the world who will take a stream and divert that stream to flood a field to grow food. Or there's no other creatures in this world which will manipulate the environment to an extent to produce what today we call civilization. But that comes at an expense. You see, this is the point. Our kupuna is also telling us that's because of this intelligence, this consciousness that we have. Wherever we as human beings have come upon this earth, we have wreaked havoc. We have the potential to destroy. And therefore, that's why within our cosmogony, it's an important lesson that yes, we should celebrate our consciousness, but we should always be aware that we have the potential to cause great harm upon this planet. And I would suggest that is the situation that we find ourselves today. We have climate change not because of the dolphins, right? We have the heating of the surfaces and the melting of the ice caps, not because of the penguins, but because of the Kanaka. In fact, more specifically, because of the kind of thinking that exists into this world. You know, we have to remember when you go back to the biblical sense, as well in comparison, when they look at the world as something to be subdued, something to be dominated, something to be used and exploited, that's a very, I would say that's a very dangerous worldview. And in fact, that is the worldview which has brought us to this point. And like many so-called native peoples, I believe that these cosmogonies, these ideas that so-called indigenous and native peoples have, and I would suggest that all peoples have. If you go back and study ancient Europe, you would realize they have the same ideas. That the earth, the world, the waters, the trees, the land are all something that connects us. And in fact, is not something to be seen as something we should exploit. And I think we're at a time in this world where we better wake up. Our consciousness better wake up and understand that we need to change our thinking. Yeah, as the great revolutionary said, you know, as a man thinketh, so is in his heart. So if we can change the way we think about who we are in this world, perhaps if we start to truly understand that we are connected from the stars and that we have these relationships with all life forms. And in fact, we as human beings, as intelligent as we are the youngest and the babies in this great family, and start to see the world as familial and not as something to be dominated. You know, science is important, but we must recognize science is always pure, like mathematics, it's always pure. I always say we gotta watch out for the scientists. Science can do wonderful things, but science can be very destructive. Think about what happens to places like in the Pacific. We can look at Inuwatok, Rongelap, Bikini Atoll, where for the expansion of the United States military and the nuclear program, these islands were destroyed. And the radioactive materials are here in the Pacific, in fact, continue to be dumped in this Pacific Ocean. That we have become the guinea pigs in many ways for this imperial-minded, holy world, as if we are sacrificial for that world. We can talk about Whangafa, Muraroa, right? Where the French into the 1990s continued to do nuclear testing in the Pacific. We can talk about Kalama Atoll, Johnson Island, which still to this day, and as long as other atolls, hold the chemical weaponry that are dumped into the Pacific. We can talk about the Western Shoshone. We can talk about the Dakota peoples. We can talk about the unceded territories of Canada. We can talk about the people of Papua, Bougainville. This is a common story you see around the whole world, where empire still exists in this world at the expense of our people. Empire does not just happen. Empire, as the great Haunani-Kea Trask said, is death. Empire is death for our people, peoples like ours. So what do we do as people? It's important at this time that we speak. It's important at this time that we share, that we continue on this conversation to understand. We really have no choice at this point. that all human beings, I repeat, all human beings have a humanity. And this idea that in fact some human beings are less than others and should be treated as less than is really at the core of this destruction of this planet. In Hawaii today, we have the revival of this consciousness that we call aloha aina or aloha aina oia i'o. The word aloha means love. It means to have compassion, to have empathy. Yeah, I know that a lot of people perhaps in California think aloha means hi or hello and goodbye. It doesn't mean hello and goodbye. Aloha means to have love and compassion for your fellow human being. This is how we greet. This is how we say goodbye, is to say we love you. That is our culture. The word aina, as I talked about, that which feeds us, the land itself, where we come from, the relationships that we have with our surroundings. And the third word, oia i'o, which means truth, to be genuine, to be real. So in many ways, this is ancient philosophy that has very much a strong meaning, and not just a political meaning, but also an economic meaning, a social meaning. I think a consciousness that the whole world can understand, first of all, and can buy into. That if we will survive, not just as a species, but for this place to survive, it will take all of us having love and recognizing aina and recognizing truth, especially when we talk about democracy and the ethics of democracy. Without truth, there is no way or process to so-called democracy. So aloha aina oia i'o is something that you see very much today, and I just got to do a quick shout out, and I'm sorry, emotional about this, but for me, it's hard for me not to be involved with things on the land and in the struggle. And right now, my brother and sister, Ke'eo Moku Kapu, and sister Uilani, in fact, I know there are 4 wahine, kupuna wahine, 4 of our so-called grandmothers are currently staging a protest and are actually sitting in a job site, fighting for the protection of our Native Hawaiian burials and our Native Hawaiian sacred sites. And, when we think about the fact that we, to this day, as a Native people, that we still have to fight to this day to prove that we are human beings, that we have a cosmogony, we have a history, we have a language, we have a spirituality, that it takes to this day that we must fight. But see, we understand this is nothing that Hawaii has in solitude. Go and look at the news and see what's happening in places like Palestine. Look at what's happening in Papua. Look what's happening in Dakota at Standing Rock. Look what's happening with my brothers and sisters up in the unceded territories of Canada. Look at what's happening in places like Detroit, where people have to fight for survival of clean water. How has humanity, in fact, that's the question, is that even humanity? When one human being can treat another human being in this way. See, this idea that somehow, this idea of religious studies, that civilization was brought here to Hawaii is the first big lie in of itself. It was not civilization that was brought here. It was empire and imperialism that was brought here for the purpose of subjugation, for the purpose of exploitation, for the purpose of subjugating our peoples in the lands, so that a few can benefit of the pain, of the destruction, and the subjugation of our peoples to this day. But I'm always reminded by our kupuna, again going back to the kumulipo, that we need to recognize that we have this familiar relationship with everything around us. In Hawaiian we say, it's not that we eat, you are what you eat. In Hawaiian thinking, you are what you eat, eats. And so it's always important to understand that we have a hierarchy of life. The land supports the food, it supports the water, that of course supports our lives as human beings. So if we're talking about place-based democracy, we must start with the idea of recognizing place and the so-called peoples of that place. and to be honest and truthful about those histories, to recognize that all peoples have a humanity, which means that all peoples have a right to determine for themselves, to define for themselves what is sacred, in fact, what is life. And I see my brother Greg there, and brother, where are we going?
Aloha, Kaleikoa.
I know I'm kind of just going off to the left tangent, but you know.
Hey, better than the alternative. No, thank you so much. We're learning. I learn so much from you every time, so mahalo. A challenge.
Yeah.
Another way to go at this. I'd love to hear you tell the story in a nutshell, taking us from Kalo and the stories of the origin of Kalo up to food sovereignty in the present. How are these things related?
Yes.
Because I think that drills down to some of the very issues you've been talking about, how traditional oral narratives are alive today in the food you choose to eat, but that the very food resources are compromised by the kinds of empire you're talking about. So tell us a little bit about the food sovereignty movement. Tell us about Kalo and what it is, and that maybe Christians aren't the only ones who eat the divine.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important way. I mean, I think it's, yeah, so I'm going to try to tighten it up, but we have in one of our cosmologies, actually, which is in the Kumulipo, but occurs way later, we have the story about what we call Owakia and Papa. Owakia, kahikolo meo papa pahana mukatawi ni hanao tahiti tu tahiti moe hanao tia papa hanao tia papa lani hana Hawaii kamuku makayapu, which is a long story which talks about how we appeared also. And in this mythology, in this story, we have what we call Wakia. Yeah, Wakia, of course, is many times referred to as the above space or the sky. Yeah, and the word Akia or Wakia means expansive or broad. And then we have Papa or Papa Nui Hanau Moku. Yeah, Papa, which also means like flat, but is referred to as the female power, the power of of the land itself. And Papa has great power to birth. That's her power. And they have a daughter, and her name is Ho'ohoku Kalani. And they have what is born are all the gods and goddesses, and then in fact, what is actually born are the islands themselves from this sexual mating. And so you see very much where you have the cosmos, and then you have the land. And then you have the mating between Wakia and Ho'ohoku Kalani. And when they're mating, it said that she's pregnant. And so when it's time for her to give birth, she births this child. But the child, in fact, is stillborn, called Keke Alualu. And he turns to his kahuna, to his religious advisor, and he asks, Kamoawe, what should they do? And he says, take this stillborn child and plant him on the east side of the house, the side where the sun rises. And so they take and they plant this stillborn child into the ground. And from the ground is born what becomes the first kalo plant, or the first kalo, or we say the first taro. Yeah, taro. They mate again, and then is born the second child. Now the first child, the taro, his name in fact is Haloa Nakalau Kapalili, or Haloa, the long hard, long stalk, Naka, which means to shake, Lau, which is leaf, and Kapalili, which is to quiver. And it's kind of the idea, if you ever see a taro plant, what it looks like when the wind blows on it, as if it's dancing and it's alive. And that is the first child. The second child that she has, his name is Haloa. And he is named Haloa in reverence, I repeat, in reverence of his older brother, Haloa Nakalau Kapalili. And Haloa, the human, the younger, is the ancestor of all Lahuikanak, all Hawaiian people are descendant of Haloa. But in this important story, it tells you in this familiar relationship that we as human beings are younger than the kalo, the taro. And therefore, as the younger brother or sibling, we must respect and honor our older sibling. And the taro, as the older sibling, yeah, what is their duty, or kuleana as we say in Hawaiian, is to feed and care for the younger, like older brothers and sisters care for the younger. But even above the taro, of course, we should recognize that the land itself, the islands itself are older. But in this mythology, in this lesson, this allegory, it tells us who we are as human beings. That in fact, we are the younger sibling to the taro and the land. That what is our duty? Our duty, in fact, is to honor, right? And care for our older sibling, including the land. And in fact, this idea that the land will take care of us comes from this mo'olelo, this story. And so what does it mean for us today? Now, what it tells us as a lesson today, that we as people, as we eat off this land, right, we actually literally eat our elders, our gods, our familial relatives. And therefore, the nourishment that we receive, again, is within this idea of nourishment. So what does that tell us when we look in Hawaii? Well, let's go kind of take it to a modern issue, which is kind of getting a little better. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, really, we were in the middle of a strong fight in regards to GMO industrial farming of our lands, where many of our lands were controlled by these corporations, which I'll not name, but you can figure out, who used our so-called agricultural lands to grow not just the genetically modified foods, which was mainly corn. And I shouldn't use the word food, because the corn that was grown in Hawaii was not to eat. Okay. Now, what is most dangerous about this kind of farming wasn't so much the genetically modified question, which is science again, but it was the huge amounts of insecticides and pesticides and all these kinds of poisons that they would spray upon those plants, of course. Now in Hawaii, we must remember, in Hawaii was the world's largest open air testing facility for these kinds of industrial farms. And so in the end, when you really think about why would we even consider using some of the most important agricultural lands to use these kinds of scientific technologies to poison these lands. In fact, if I had more time to explain, these kinds of poisons basically kill everything within the soil. To therefore create foods that would be shipped, of course, and used around the rest of the world. Now, what you find, of course, is a huge backlash against genetically modified foods, not just because of the GMO question, but I think more dangerously because of the kinds of poisons and pesticides and insecticides that are used upon these lands. And in fact, in Hawaii, what's most terrible about it, Hawaii is the testing ground for many, many years for these kinds of poisons. And we all know these poisons don't disappear. They leach into the ground, which leach into the ocean, into the streams, into our drinking water, and even to this day, as we say, our grandchildren will probably end up paying for those crimes committed by those multinational industrial food corporations who use Hawaii as their testing ground, right? Instead of being a place to actually grow food. So when you kind of tie it into, today's world, what I guess I'm trying to say is, so we got to recognize, just because it's scientifically based, it doesn't necessarily mean it's something that's good for everyone. Now, it might be good for the farmer in Nebraska, because the negative results of that kind of farming here doesn't impact that farmer in Nebraska. But no different than what happened to Inuatok and Rongelap and Big. My point is that we as Native peoples end up facing the brunt of this exploitation and destruction of environment, so that these multinational corporations can make a profit. Instead of doing things the right way for the future and all generations, something that's regenerative and it's something that we all can benefit from, the idea, of course, with GMO farming is to exploit as much as possible, to grow as fast as you can, to turn the quickest and biggest profit you can at that point, at the expense of the future.
Yeah, for sure. No doubt. Thank you for that. Well, maybe just tell us for a minute or two the positive side of the story. That is, at least in my experience, the prevalence of Aipono in the community is growing and growing. Certainly that was the case up on Mauna Kea and elsewhere that I've been involved with, the people eating local foods, the food sovereignty movement, and that, as you already gestured towards. The very eating of those foods is to reconnect with tradition itself, with the language, with the ritual protocol, and so forth. I mean, I'm not imagining that, right? These things are happening on the ground. Kalo production is cranking up, but the price of land and water makes that difficult. But there's a very positive food sovereignty movement connected to traditional stories. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, what's also important to understand that historically, if you look at tradition, Hawaii really was, I mean, really remarkable and outstanding when it comes to food production. When you understand the history of Hawaii, where we come from, you know, people forget that Hawaii is the most wettest spot in the earth. On Hawaii, for example, Hawaii Ale, that we have volcanic soil and agriculture. So we have, you know, when it comes to the paradise of food production, that's where we come from. So our kupuna, our ancestors, understanding that, we're able to create food production really unlike anywhere in the world. If you read the earliest journals of people like Captain Cook and others who came early on, when they came to Hawaii, they could not believe what they found and what they saw. The potential, the power of basically gardens and food crops everywhere, from taro, both wetland and dry land, to sweet potatoes, to yams, to breadfruit, where they would have breadfruit forests where you could walk under the shade for miles. Now, what had happened, of course, is that that kind of food production later on was taken over, you know, through the imperialists and empire, where those kinds of lands were converted and transformed to becoming sugar plantations and pineapple fields, which of course, not just dedicate to a lot of use of water, but also poisons and pesticides. And so what has happened in the last, 20, 30 years, as the consciousness of our people, especially young people today, which begin to really understand, not just as a cultural element or spiritual element to connect to the land, to farm our own food, to eat from our own land, but understanding as a practical sense, as a human sense, that what you see going on a lot in Hawaii is that you see people returning to the land. So the things I always say, it's not so much as important as about Hawaiians returning, as the land returning to us. But we must flip that, of course, it's really about us returning to the land. That we should stop depending upon the Safeway and the Costco's and the containers which bring food from outside, knowing the potential that these lands have. And what you find, of course, is that today, many of our young people are getting back into those kinds of traditional farming, which today people call organic farming and those kind of farming. Even things involving like our fisheries, that people forget that it is in Hawaii that the kind of aquaculture or fish farming began. It begins in Hawaii. And so the potential for Hawaii to being this place of a magnificent amount of food is something that's very much tied into our cultural and spiritual ideas, that they're really one and the same. So when we think about we are what we eat, I mean, literally, it's exactly that. We are buried into these lands itself. Everywhere we walk upon these lands, we literally walk upon the bones or iwi of our ancestors. Everywhere we grow food, we literally are eating from the soil of our ancestors. So when you think about this kind of regenerative farming, in the literal sense, that's exactly who we are as a people. We are the land. We are the rain. We are the wind. And not in a sense of something, this kind of, these ideas, this kind of, witch doctor kind of, cultural kind of, goody feeding kind of, but I'm talking very much in a physical science, in a practical sense.
Yeah.
What we do to the land is what we do to ourselves. Yep. So if we treat the land with respect, if we treat the water with highest regard, in sense, again, it's all about taking care of ourselves. And I think when you look at the world, what's going on in the world today, that's really at the core, I think, of the kinds of issues that, if you think about ethics, you're thinking about taking care of the world. It's really about the world changing the way we see ourselves in the world, that the world is not something just to dominate and exploit and extract resources from, but the world is something we should try to remember how to restore ourselves in this relationship with our ancestors, which is everything around us.
Yeah. Ele kaumai.
Eli eli kauma.
One last question from me, and then we have a couple questions in the Q&A box, including one about Mauna Kea, a delicate local issue, as you might know, here on this campus. And so we want to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, wait.
Kind of summing up so much of what you talked about today, as far as I understand it, is the concept of kuleana. Could you tell us what kuleana is and unpack it with regard to a land ethics, how you relate to Malama Aina?
Yeah, so kuleana, in a simple way, it means a responsibility. It means like privilege. Kuleana is something that you earn, something might be awarded to you, but kuleana is the idea of having this kind of responsibility, this kind of privilege to do or not do. And we all have kuleana. And I'm going to do let me tell you a short story. Many years ago, it might be like 20 now, getting older. I was at this, it was actually a political science colloquium or forum that was going on. And anyway, there was this kind of big debate was going on between this Hawaiian professor and this political science professor. And make a long story short, someone from the audience who was being critical of the Hawaiian said, I don't hear you guys talking about democracy. Where's the democracy in your decision making? And I quickly stood up and I said, well, first of all, you come with this false sense of idea that somehow you can define democracy and that you really understand what democracy is, right? Democracy is we all have one vote. We all have our 5 minutes of, everybody talks for 5 minutes. That's in that sense of the Haole world of democracy. In the Hawaiian sense of what we call democracy, I would use the word kuleana, is very different. And so I shared this story, is like, if we were talking about management of reef resources in the ocean, right? And we're talking about the protection of the reef in the ocean. In Hawaiian idea, in our democratic ideas, or in a sense of kuleana, if we were all meeting to kind of talk about and discuss what should we do with the ocean, we would, in a Hawaiian sense, we would quickly realize that not everyone has the same kuleana. Yeah. There are certain voices that have more kuleana than others. And obviously, those who are in the ocean, those who are fisher people, they in fact have more kuleana. So in Hawaiian sense, it's not like we all should have our 1 minute to talk. In Hawaiian sense, those people perhaps should be the only ones to speak, or perhaps they should be the ones who have a larger amount of talking space. And so in a Hawaiian sense, that's democracy, because it's not about everyone having their 1 minute. What's more important is recognizing that we all have different kuleana, and then recognizing that we all have different responsibilities that we should be aware of and respectful of. And I think that's a very important point to kind of make out in regards to today's world, that people somehow believe, in fact, that if you all have your 2 minutes, or if you all testify, or if you all have, you all vote, that somehow that democracy has been taken care of. Mm-hmm. Without really realizing what is the point of democracy. Again, what is the point of democracy if we're all not treated equal? If we all don't have enough to eat? If we all don't have a warm place to sleep in? So it's not what democracy is, I think that's important, but what is the purpose of democracy? In the same way with kuleana, that we in fact inherit this kuleana sometimes, not by choice, but the idea, depending upon our history, depending on our families, kuleana in itself, that might drive us to do what we need to do, not because by choice, but because of responsibility. And I think that's a very different kind of worldview that is in clashing in many ways. Why do Native people stand up and struggle for the protection of the environment? Because it is our kuleana to continue, even though that we have been dehumanized for generations, the fact that we still fight to protect for clean water. We still fight for the people in California to have the salmon runs or what have you. We still fight to protect our sacred sites like Mauna Kea, because we have the kuleana to do so. I think this is a very important point to recognize that when Hawaiians ask, for example, and I'm going right into the Mauna Kea question, and I should let you ask that question before I go. And
Yeah. Okay, well, there have been a couple, well, thank you. First of all, this is all so helpful and so spot on the topic we're trying to deal with all year long here. So, mahalo. A couple questions have jumped up in the box. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but a couple. One is about thinking from a traditional point of view, the narratives you've set out, relationships to animals in terms of hunting them and harvesting them. Help us understand that relationship. That's one. And then on the Mauna Kea question, just asking, raising the obvious issue that this university is implicated in what's happening with TMT by way of our chancellor and so forth. The question, the way I would want to frame it for you is, as you know, this is a process I've followed fairly closely in various ways. And what struck me is that through the so-called consultation process, that voices from the community have not, in fact, been heard very clearly, and particularly on the point of to what degree is living tradition exhibited in this movement? To what degree is this about living Hawaiian, you can call it religion, culture, tradition? Now, I'm biased, of course, but I see that very much unfolding on the slopes of Mauna Kea, whether at Pu'uhuluhulu or at Lake Waiau or elsewhere. And that's an unbroken chain that goes way, way back. That hasn't been articulated, not through the mechanisms of the state, and certainly not to TMT. So what would you say to that rather leading question about how is tradition in play in this issue?
I mean, that's a real big question, but let me kind of jump as best as I can. I think what you find most importantly, what we call a contemporary struggle over Mauna Kea, really is a rebirth and rejuvenation, revitalization in many ways of our traditions. That we got to remember, historically, people have to understand that Native peoples, indigenous peoples are living in this world, in this context. And so to have that idea that somehow to be authentic, again, this idea of authentic, that somehow we gotta live like they were living back in 1778 before the coming of Captain Cook, is part of that sickness. And I'm gonna use the word sickness very clearly, because when it comes down to the end, who should define for Kanaka what a modern Kanaka should be? But of course, the Kanaka. But what you find many times is that you hear the same kind of arguments where you hear, I hear in the United States many times people will say, they're not living like real Indians. And again, who should define what a real Indian is in this world but an Indian himself? Or they don't look like real Indians, or they don't eat like, again, the point is that the right to determine for yourself is a critical cultural element of a people. And I think that's the part that people fail to realize, that it is cultural for you to define for yourself who you are as a people first. What is considered sacred or not? What is considered something that should be protected or not? Now, when you look at what happened in Mauna Kea or Pu'uhuluhulu, I think that's an excellent example, of what you saw happening, where it really was not just a struggle about Mauna Kea. See, this is where the media and the governor and those who are kind of like, they're making this issue bigger than the telescope. Exactly, it is bigger than it. Again, they're missing the point. Yeah. The reason why the fight over Mauna Kea reached such an epic proportion is because our people, I'm talking about the Kanaka Maoli, and those who live with us, the non-Kanaka Maoli live with us, understand that we are rebirthing ourselves. This is not like, that the reason why we struggle is because our consciousness has grew to the point, not when it was a handful of us in the past, but when you look at the generations of the young people that are coming, when you look at me and it's, oh, your generation is so radical. I said, radical. The truth is always radical. Being Hawaiian in this world is radical. The fact that you have to find ways to survive in this world is a radical. It's a lot easier just to stick your head in the sand and go with the flow downstream. It's a lot harder to struggle and voice yourself and to struggle for those things. So when you look at Pu'uhuluhulu, what is more powerful? If they thought my generation was radical, Wait till you see what's going on in these upcoming generations that are in college and in high school today. The young generation that are walking in Hawaii today are not confused really at all about who they are as a people. In fact, my father's generation was a generation in which they miseducated them to the point to teach them that to be Hawaiian was something, of course, negative that you should run away from and not want to be. My generation was one who began the process of trying to rebirth this reconnection. My children's generation have no issue with expressing themselves as well. So when I talk about Mauna Kea, I always say, and let me be clear to those at the University of California, this is not an issue that will go away. In fact, I would say this is an issue that you will lose in the end. And if it will cost you millions of dollars in investment, it will cost you millions of dollars, because the truth is it's not that we're getting any weaker. In fact, we're getting stronger and stronger. What you saw happen last summer is just the top of the iceberg in many ways, because when you see what's going on in Hawaii today, within the last year, connected to Mauna Kea, you had issues popping up all over. And so Mauna Kea really, I think, was a important access point where for the first time in generations, our people are no longer afraid at all to act, behave, to speak as Hawaiians, to determine for ourselves our future. And so I know you kind of experienced, I said, you experienced what happened at Puhulu Hulu, which was a kind of, it's hard to explain to people who experienced that, but what you saw was a really rebirth of our people's nationhood and consciousness of who we are. So it wasn't just about fighting against the telescopes. We were talking about food sovereignty. We were talking about new ways of looking for power and energy. We're looking at different ways of, in other words, living and existing in today's world. And I think that's what I found as being so powerful. Yeah. That we are not trapped in the past at all. We are inspired, we are anchored by that knowledge of the past. But what you see is a people that's alive today, that in fact will struggle and expect to live on into the future. Now with, kind of tying that with the telescope, I just want to, kind of make this point also that, the University of California, again, unfortunately, do not see themselves as part of the settler colonial regime, which has imposed themselves for far too long on these islands. And what they expect, in fact, it's going to be the same old story. Unfortunately, they haven't realized what's been going on in the community for the last few decades. That there is a rebirth in our consciousness. Of course, it says, as a man thinketh, so will he be. That today, when you hear our people talk about the struggle of Mauna Kea, again, is just a starting point in many ways for what's going to happen. And I'm a big believer that, I always welcome these kinds of struggles, because it's these kinds of struggles that will make our people even stronger, more determined. And, as they say, the stronger your so-called foe is, the stronger you get as a people. And if they believe somehow that, we're just going to lay down and not speak out against them and not speak the truth. See, this is the point, to speak the truth, that unfortunately, when I have conversations with astronomers, and let me just end with this story. Maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I was at a meeting when an astronomer, world famous astronomer, came up to me and he said, Kaleikoa, Mauna Kea belongs to the world. And I turned to him and I said, well, first of all, who the hell are you to somehow believe that you speak for the world? You see, that's your supremacist mentality, that somehow believe that he speaks for the world, first of all. You don't realize, no, you don't speak for the world. Secondly, and I asked him, how do you have kuleana to Mauna Kea? What is your relationship to Mauna Kea? Of course, he had only been in Hawaii for 7 years at that point. But he, in his sickness, somehow believed that he had some kind of power, authority to give Mauna Kea to the rest of the world without acknowledging the true history of Mauna Kea, which, let's be clear, let me be clear. Our people have never given consent to any of those telescopes on Mauna Kea. From day one, our people have spoken out against it. Now, our voices back when the first telescope, when it was built, was very minimal. But not today. We've grown and rebirthed ourselves today. So my point is, what is most important is the truth and facts. And this is where I turn to that scientist and I say, gee, it's amazing. You profess science and you profess facts and the truth. Suppose it, that's what you profess. But when I ask you, who owns the land in which those telescopes currently exist, and in fact, where the TMT wants to be constructed, who does the lands belong to? And unfortunately, he could not find himself to speak the truth, which of course is that those lands to this day belong to our people, which we've never given consent. It's not just, I'm not just saying this from the feeling, I'm talking about legal authority in law. Second, the idea that he should have a say over the determining of what should happen to Mauna Kea is reeking with secularism, which is part of the idea of racism. In other words, the idea that somehow, in order for him to believe that, he must not recognize our humanity as a people. He refuses to acknowledge that we are a people. The Kanaka Maoli, the Lahui Kanaka are a real people. And we have a right as a people to determine for ourselves what happens upon the land. So when I look at University of California, this is my challenge to University of California. Do they recognize the Lahui Kanaka as human beings? And if so, if we are human beings with 2 hands and 10 fingers and 2 eyes, and if they truly recognize us as human beings, then therefore they must recognize that we have a humanity. And if we have a humanity, we have a right to determine for ourselves our spirituality, determine for ourselves and define for ourselves what our future should be. And more importantly, to define and determine for ourselves what we should be upon our own lands. Because if they cannot prove and if they cannot show that they have any title to those lands, or if they cannot show that they have any kuleana to those lands, then I ask them as fellow human beings to recognize that we, as the human beings of this place, have a right to determine for ourselves, our humanity. Because in the end, it is about humanity. And what the University of California is doing to us is one of dehumanizing, of dehumanization of other beings who live upon this planet.
Mahalo. Thank you for saying all of that. And it's important that that be on the record, in the sense that as someone who's attended to this process at the state level, but also in the protection camp and so forth, that's what really struck me, is that the universities involved, including University of California, simply don't have an adequate record of what's happening. It's been mediated to them in so many different ways, but not without taking real stock of the vitality of the human movement on the ground at so many levels that ought to trigger various forms of oversight and engagement, not to mention the question of consent. So it's important in this kind of environment that the scales be leveled out just a little bit, that at a very minimum, that your ability to be forthright and tell us how you're seeing it in the camps to this community here. I sat in on a regents meeting on Zoom this summer that was a Mauna Kea update for the system-wide. And there was so little in the way of information from what's been happening on the ground as you describe it. So I just want to mahalo you for filling out some of that. And I hope people have ears to hear, because as we ethically grapple with questions of institutional accountability and so forth, this isn't just about land. It's not about democracy writ large. It's about institutional behaviors. And part of that, as good scholars even, not to mention human beings, is fully assessing evidence in front of us. And that just simply hasn't been done, I think.
Yeah, I think it's the most, but just to, again, just to say the most important element for those who might not know anything about Mauna Kea is that it's really no different that went on in Standing Rock, that goes on in the unceded territory. I mean, it's the same question, which is who has a right to determine for themselves who they are in their own homeland? And so the first question, of course, that the University of California should ask is exactly what is the kuleana of the University of California upon Mauna Kea? And if they cannot answer that question, if they do not have kuleana, you see, that's the point you got to realize. Then all they are, they're really no different than any other imperialists and settler colonialists who are just seeking to further exploit and use native peoples for their own selfish benefit.
Yeah,
and that's the most important point. That
I think you're absolutely right.
Interrogate and find and seek the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are many good people in this system who have an ear for this kind of approach and a real value on these sorts of questions. So, so thank you for raising that to our attention. Absolutely. We just have a few minutes. Could you, a colleague of mine raised this question about in the Hawaiian cosmogony, as you laid it out, the familial relationships. How does this relate to hunting ethics? Say you go take the life of a pig.
Yeah.
How is someone understanding that? What's that family relationship mean at that moment? I think is the gist of the question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we omnivores. That's number one. That's the first thing. But secondly, I think we've always had there is again. Remember I talked about the idea of pono from our cosmology is always this idea of everything needs to be in balance. So if you look at not just our cultural ways, we are natural conservators. We are part of our culture. I mean, it's fundamental. Yeah, first is based upon sharing. All resources belong to whom? Everyone. See, there's a reason why in Hawaii, water is not privately owned. Water belongs to everyone. This is my point is to understand. In other words, we all share in the resources. That's why fundamentally in our traditions, if I went fishing in traditional times and I caught 40 fish, I can perhaps only eat 10 of them. What happens to the 30? Well, because we have no profit motive, we have no banking system, the 30, of course, will be shared with everyone else within what in Hawaii we call ahupua, within your so-called village. Yep. And so we all shared. Now, there was no incentive to go and catch as much as I can because I had no market to sell those so-called fishes. And so everything that could be eaten, especially if it tasted good, would be eaten. But it was always under the idea that we would all benefit from the so-called resources. So that's why within our culture, management in the Hollywood world, we got to manage our resources. It's a core element of our culture to take what only you need to eat. And again, if you cannot eat it, why take it? And so whatever, if you take that would be considered extra, would be something to be shared. Now, in regards to the kinds of food that we eat, we really had no rules in regards to saying, perhaps certain animals would be eaten or certain ones would not. But we did have, especially in our fisheries, for sure, what we call the kapu system. So the word kapu kind of means like restrictions, where we always had this management rule or law, I should say. Yeah, it's a cultural law, which means that certain fish could only be caught at certain times of the year because we understood, right? Fish spawn, or they have certain times they would move around in the islands. And so we definitely practice a system of management where it became law and cultural law, whereby you would not overtake, or you would not especially take from species at the time where they're probably most productive. And so this is not something that was brought into Hawaii. This is something, in fact, we were actually trying to reinstall in Hawaii to manage things like our fisheries, to manage our waters, to manage, in fact, one of the big horrific histories, of course, is the management of waters during the sugar plantations and and pineapple plantations, where they began to take water really from one side of the island and ship it all the way over to the other side, first for the sugar plantations. But after the sugar plantations left, what was the big industry? Well, golf courses and hotel resorts.
Yeah.
Who still to this day will take water from one side of the island and ship it, I should say ship it, but and channel it all the way to the other. And so, you know, when we think about management of resources, I think it's always important to realize in the Hawaiian sense, yeah, that all resources, because we come from an island mentality, all resources not are just shared, but have to be managed in a way to protect them for future generations. Because it's not for you, it's for all of us. So, you know, again, that's a very important, and that's why going to this idea of private property ownership is a very important piece of our political and, you know, economic future.
Mahalo. No, that's a great way to tie it up. Listen, I'm sorry to say we're out of time here. We had a whole lot of people tune in, both here on Zoom and on Facebook. This has been recorded, so we'll post it on the Walter Capps Center website. And also, Kaleikoa is a veritable celebrity. You look online, you'll find all kinds of his speeches. So if you didn't get enough, look him up. We didn't get to every question. My apologies for that, but it was a wealth of information. And Kaleikoa, you launched us into what will be a year-long conversation, and I hope even longer. Maybe in the spring we can get you to tune back in and hear where we've been in this conversation and join us again. But so many mahalos. This is so rich, and I know your time is precious right now, especially. So thank you.
Yeah. Aloha, aina, oia i'o.
Aloha, aina. Okay. All right. Take care, everybody. And I hope I see you soon. Okay. Aloha.
Hey, Greg. Aloha.